Hello everyone. Tonight we begin with something a little darker. The Great Plague of London of 1665. You might picture a city of great ships and new discoveries. But for the average person, life was less about adventure and more about trying not to die tonight. The truth is, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who is joining us from all over the world. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum. And let's embark on tonight's journey together. The winter of 1664 hung over London, not as a pure white blanket, but as a grey, damp blanket. It clung to the timber frames of the crowded houses, dripped from the overhanging roofs, and turned the unpaved streets into shallow pools of mud and misery. The cold was a living thing, a presence that seeped through the cracks in the walls and settled in the bones of the Londoners. In the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, this cold seemed to have a particularly cruel edge. St. Giles was not the heart of London, far from it. It lay outside the old Roman walls of the city in the county of Middlesex, a sprawling suburb that had grown uncontrollably, a maze of narrow alleys and dark courtyards. It was a place where houses leaned on one another for support, blocking what little sunlight dared to pierce the always overcast sky. Here the density of human life was staggering. Entire families, sometimes several, were crammed into a single room, sharing the warmth of their bodies against the penetrating damp. Privacy was a luxury as unattainable as gold. The very air was thick, heavy with the smoke of sea coal, the sour smell of cheap ale, the sweat of unwashed bodies, and an underlying ever-present stench of decay. Sanitation, as we understand it, simply did not exist. The streets functioned as open sewers, the so-called kennels that ran down the centre. Into them flowed a terrible stew of human and animal waste, kitchen trash, and the occasional carcass of some unfortunate dog. Cesspits regularly overflowed, seeping their contents into the ground and often into the very water sources from which people drank. It was a paradise for rats and a perfect breeding ground for disease. No one was surprised when people died in St. Giles. Death was a constant neighbour. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, consumption, they all made their rounds with a depressing regularity. But in December of 1664, something was different. Subtly, a murmur in the parish records. One death, then another. They were recorded as anything else. Of course, the bureaucratic machinery of London mortality had its own peculiarities. The cause of death was determined by the searchers, usually elderly, poor women of the parish, who were paid a few pence to examine a corpse and declare a cause. Their medical training was non-existent. Their diagnosis was based on folklore, superstition, and what they were told by the grieving relatives, who had a strong interest in avoiding one particular word. That word was plague. A diagnosis of plague meant disaster. It meant the shutting up of the house, the loss of trade, being cast out, and most likely the death of the entire household. So when a man named Richard Andrews died in early December, followed shortly by his wife Rebecca Andrews, no one uttered the dreaded word. Perhaps it was spotted fever or the flu. Anything would do. Yet the symptoms were troubling to those who knew what to look for. High fever, delirium, and most tellingly, the painful swellings in the groin or armpits, the buboes, the tokens of the plague. Through that winter, the disease seemed to flicker like a candle in a draught. There were a few more deaths in St. Giles and a neighbouring St. Clement Danes. Then, for several weeks, nothing. The deep cold of winter seemed to have smothered it. Life in its grimy, bustling form carried on. Londoners, always an optimistic bunch in the face of hardship, breathed a collective sigh of relief. Perhaps it had been a false alarm, an echo of past plagues that had failed to take hold. But the organism that caused the disease, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, had not gone away. It was simply waiting. It lay dormant, hibernating in its hosts, waiting for the warmth, waiting for spring. It was in the blood of the city's black rats, those nimble, shadowy creatures that lived in the walls, the ceilings, and the cellars, an invisible army moving in parallel to the world of men. And upon the rats in their dark fur travelled the true horsemen of this miniature apocalypse, the fleas. The question that hung over those few winter cases, a question that would only be asked with the urgency of panic months later, was where it had come from. This visitor was not native to English shores. Like so many things in London, good and bad, it had come up the river. It had sailed in on the Thames, The Thames was London's main artery, its primary highway of commerce and communication with the wider world. Its muddy waters were constantly choked with a forest of masts. Ships of all sizes and origins worked their way up and down the river, from small river barges to towering three-masted merchant ships. The London docks, a chaotic jumble of wharves, warehouses and taverns stretching east of the Tower of London, were a hive of activity. Here were unloaded silks from Persia, spices from the East Indies, wine from France, and most importantly for our story, cotton and textiles from the Low Countries. In the years 1663 and 1664, Amsterdam, London's great commercial rival, had been ravaged by a terrible epidemic of bubonic plague. The Dutch city had lost tens of thousands of its citizens. Despite the tense political relations between England and the Dutch, which would soon erupt into the Second Anglo-Dutch War, trade continued. Profit, as always, outweighed caution. Dutch merchant ships continued to arrive at the London docks, bringing their valuable cargoes, and in the holds of those ships, hidden amongst the bolts of cloth and sacks of grain, travelled undeclared passengers. The black rats, ratus, were excellent seafarers. They were perfectly at home on ships with plentiful food and dark corners in which to nest, and with them came their fleas, Xenopsilla chiopis. The cycle of transmission was an elegant and deadly piece of biological theatre. A flea would bite an infected rat, ingesting the plague bacteria. Inside the flea's gut, the bacteria would multiply rapidly, forming a sticky mass that blocked its digestive tract. The flea, now starving and desperate, would attempt to feed again, biting another rat, or if one was not available, a nearby warm-blooded host, such as a London dock worker. Unable to swallow, the flea would regurgitate bacterial-laden blood directly into the bite wound. The cycle had begun. It is thought that one or several of these ships, likely mooring at the docks of Rotherhithe or Stepney in autumn of 1664, carried this deadly gift. Once the ship was docked, the infected rats, agile climbers, would descend the thick mooring ropes and scurry ashore, disappearing into the maze of warehouses and tenements of the dockside parishes. Here they found a new paradise. The warehouses were full of grain, the alleyways full of garbage. London's native rat population was already enormous, and the newcomers mingled, sharing not only territory, but also their infected parasites. The spread was sneaky and silent. There was no sudden explosion of disease at the docks. Instead, it moved slowly like an ink stain on blotting paper. An infected rat would die. Its fleas, sensing their host growing cold, would leap off in search of a new source of warmth. It might be another rat, or it might be the ankle of a dock worker, the arm of a child playing in an alley, the leg of a woman as she slept. For months, the disease likely remained largely within the rodent population, an epizootic that went unnoticed by humans. But every so often, it would jump the species barrier. A dock worker would feel unwell, feverish and chilled. His family would blame it on the damp cold from the river. He would die a few days later. His wife who nursed him would fall ill next. Then perhaps a neighbour who came to offer condolences. Each death was a personal tragedy, but not part of a recognisable pattern. Deaths in the poor, overcrowded parishes of the East End were too common to raise suspicion. The path from the docks to the parish of St. Giles further to the west was not a straight line. It was likely a meandering one carried in flea-infested bolts of cloth on the carts of rag and bone men, or simply following the natural migration of the rat population along the riverbanks and through the interconnected cellars of the city. When Rebecca Andrews died in December, it was not the beginning of the plague in London, but merely the first time it killed someone in a place where the authorities were beginning to pay a little bit of attention. The enemy was already within the gates. It had spent months establishing a beachhead, silent and invisible, and now, with the arrival of warmer weather, it was poised to launch its main offensive. As the winter of 1664 thawed into the muddy spring of 1665, official denial became a silent policy. The city magistrates and wealthy merchants had too much to lose from a panic. Trade was the lifeblood of London, and the word plague was poison to trade. The weekly mortality records, known as the Bills of Mortality, continued to show rising numbers of deaths attributed to fevers and other convenient ailments. But among the physicians, the apothecaries and the gravediggers, rumours swirled. The symptoms were unmistakable. In April and May, the numbers in the plague column of the Bills of Mortality, which had sat at 0 for weeks, began to show low but persistent figures. 1, 2, then 8, then 17. The candle that had flickered through the winter had now been rekindled, and the spring wind was fanning the flame. By June, Denial was no longer sustainable. The plague had broken out of St. Giles and was spreading with alarming speed through the neighbouring parishes of Holborn, Fleet Street, and the maze of alleys around Drury Lane. The number of officially recorded plague deaths jumped to 43 in the first week of June, then to 112, then 168, and everyone knew the true figures were much, much higher. The panic the authorities had so desperately tried to prevent began to take hold of the city. The wealthy, who had the means and the country houses to flee to, began to pack their belongings. King Charles II and his court made plans to relocate to Hampton Court and then further still to Salisbury and eventually Oxford. Their departure was the signal many had been waiting for. Soon, the roads leading out of London were choked with the carriages of aristocrats, merchants, and anyone who could afford to escape the doomed city. For those who remained behind, whether out of duty, poverty, or sheer resignation, the responsibility for managing the crisis fell to the civic authorities led by the Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Lawrence. Lawrence was a level-headed and courageous man who, unlike the king, chose to remain at his post in the city. Together with the aldermen and the Court of Common Council, he faced a task of enormous proportions to try to contain an epidemic they did not understand, using tools and methods that had been forged in previous plagues and were at best brutally ineffective. The framework for their response was based on a set of regulations known as the Plague Orders. These were not new. They were a revised and expanded version of orders issued during previous outbreaks, notably that of 1603. They were rooted in the miasmatic theory of disease, the belief that plague was spread by bad airs or poisonous vapours. But their primary strategy was not sanitation but containment. The guiding principle was simple and terrible: to isolate the sick and the healthy along with them. The central pillar of the Lord Mayor's orders was household quarantine. When a person in a house was diagnosed with the plague, the entire house was sealed. Not just the sick individual, but their entire family, their servants, their lodgers, all were locked in together. The front door was nailed shut or padlocked from the outside. Upon the door, a parish official would paint an ominous sign, a 1-foot-high red cross, and beside it, the words that would become the symbol of the suffering city: "Lord, have mercy upon us." To enforce this mass house arrest, watchmen were appointed. A watchman was posted outside each shut-up house day and night. His job was to ensure that no one left and that no one unauthorized entered. He also acted as the family's sole link to the outside world, purchasing and delivering food and other necessary supplies which would be left at the door. These watchmen were recruited from among the poorer citizens. Men paid a small sum for an incredibly dangerous job. They were constantly exposed to the disease and were often the object of their neighbours' scorn and fear. Unsurprisingly, corruption was rampant. A bribe could purchase the freedom of a healthy and desperate prisoner who might then flee, potentially carrying the disease with him. The policy of shutting up the houses was in essence a death sentence. By confining the healthy with the sick in cramped, poorly ventilated spaces, the authorities created perfect incubators for the plague. A house with the Red Cross on its door was regarded by neighbours with a mixture of pity and terror. They knew that in all likelihood no one would emerge from it alive. The writer Daniel Defoe, decades later, in his A Journal of the Plague Year, captured the desperation this policy caused. The cries from the windows, the attempts to escape, the madness that overtook entire households as they awaited their turn to die. Besides confinement, the Lord Mayor's orders attempted to regulate public life to minimise contagion. All public gatherings were banned. The theatres, which had been the pulsating heart of Restoration cultural life, closed their doors. Bear baiting, bull baiting, and other popular entertainments were cancelled. Inns and alehouses were ordered to control the number of patrons and prevent rowdy gatherings. Funerals were ordered to be held at night with no mourners accompanying the body to the grave, in an attempt to reduce crowds and exposure. Measures were taken to try to cleanse the city, albeit based on a flawed understanding of the disease. Citizens were ordered to sweep the fronts of their houses daily. Huge bonfires were lit in the streets and at crossroads, burning tar and other aromatic substances in the hope of purifying the foul air. One of the most tragic and counterproductive orders was aimed at domestic animals. Believing that cats and dogs could be carriers of the plague, the Lord Mayor ordered a mass cull. Special dog catchers were appointed who roamed the streets, killing any animal they found. An estimated 40,000 dogs and 200,000 cats were slaughtered. It was a catastrophic mistake. By eliminating the primary natural predators of rats, the authorities unwittingly allowed the rodent population, the true reservoir of the disease, to explode. The army of the plague was not just unhindered, it was reinforced. To administer this system, a bureaucracy of death was created. Each parish was divided into districts and examiners were appointed for each one. It was their job to investigate any suspicious death and report it. If plague was confirmed, the searchers would move in to officially verify it. The constable would then be informed, who would order the house sealed, and a watchman assigned. It was a system designed for order and control, an attempt to impose a bureaucratic logic on biological chaos. But as the summer wore on and the weekly deaths rose from the hundreds into the thousands, the system began to crumble under the unbearable strain. Soon, the sound of hammers nailing doors shut became part of the city's daily soundtrack, along with the constant tolling of church bells announcing another death, and the rattling of the dead carts through the cobbled streets at night. The watchmen, the red crosses, the smoking bonfires, all of it transformed the landscape of London into a nightmarish vision. The Lord Mayor's orders, born of a sense of duty and based on the conventional wisdom of the age, were not stemming the tide. At best, they were merely channeling it. The city had become a prison, and the plague was its jailer. The system was in place. The machinery of containment was turning. But the real test, the searing, deadly peak of summer, was only just beginning. The Great Visitation, as some called it with a grim and resigned humour, had formally announced its presence, and now it was settling in for a long, long stay. By the spring of 1665, fear was no longer a whisper on the docks, but a silent scream in the heart of the city. And with fear came calculation. For the men and women of substance, those who owned carriages and country homes, the equation was terrifyingly simple. London meant death. The countryside life. The exodus began not as a flood, but as a stealthy tide, a quiet, well-planned retreat from the city's core. The first to set the example, as ever, was the king. Charles II, a man who knew the art of survival well, did not wait for the plague to knock upon the gates of Whitehall. In early July, with the heat rising and the mortality figures climbing with it, the royal court packed its bags. Carriages laden with tapestries, silver, and nervous courtiers rumbled over the cobblestones, heading west towards the relative safety of Salisbury, and then on to Oxford, where the king would establish a court in exile, far from the foul air of his capital. He was not alone. The aristocracy, the judges, the bishops, the most eminent lawyers, and the wealthiest merchants followed his lead. It was a methodical evacuation of wealth and power. The great town houses along the Strand and in Covent Garden were shuttered, their furniture draped in sheets, and a handful of servants, often the least fortunate, left behind as guardians. The streets, which normally echoed with the clatter of fine carriages and the hum of important business, began to empty. The luxury shops that catered to the elite closed their doors, their owners packing up their finest silks and jewels and fleeing as well. It was as if the very lifeblood of the city was being drained away, leaving behind a pale and trembling skeleton. Leaving the city, however, was no simple matter, not even for the privileged. Panic spread faster than the disease itself, and the surrounding towns and villages, terrified that Londoners would bring the seed of the plague with them, began to set up their own barricades and patrols. To travel, one needed a certificate of health, an official document issued by the Lord Mayor declaring that the bearer and their family came from a parish free of infection. In theory, it was a sensible system of health control. In practice, it was an early lesson in how money and influence could bend bureaucracy. Certificates were forged, bribes were paid, and the guards at the city gates would often look the other way when a well-appointed coach, bearing a familiar coat of arms, demanded passage. But for the vast majority of London's 400,000 inhabitants, escape was an impossible fantasy. They were the artisans, the day labourers, the servants, the street vendors, the dock workers. Their lives were anchored to the city streets. They had no country estate to retreat to. Their savings, if they existed at all, would not cover a journey of a few miles, let alone sustain them for months in a strange and hostile place. They were trapped by poverty, trapped by the need to work until the very last possible moment, and trapped by a system that now required them to have a certificate of health, which was for them all but unobtainable, without connections or money for bribes. A poor man with a cough was seen as a plague carrier, while a noble man with a fever was merely considered unwell. And so London became divided into two cities. One was a ghost town of shuttered mansions and abandoned businesses. The other laid directly over it was an open-air prison densely populated and terrified. The outer parishes like Stepney and Whitechapel, which housed the poorest in a maze of narrow alleys and ramshackle tenements, became epicenters of the disease. Here, people lived on top of one another, sharing wells, privies, and unwittingly the fleas that carried the Yersinia pestis bacterium. The exodus of the wealthy had a devastating side effect. It crippled the economy upon which the poor depended. With the gentry gone, there were no customers for the tailor, the cobblers, or the wig makers. With the merchants fled, the docks fell silent, and the warehouses stood idle. Hunger became a companion, as constant as the fear of the disease. The Lord Mayor, Sir John Lawrence, and the city's aldermen, to their credit, remained. They faced an enormous task, trying to maintain order, organize the disposal of the dead, and distribute meagre aid to a populace sinking into despair. But they were a skeletal government in a dying city. The streets once teeming with life now held only those who could not leave, those too sick to move, and those who clung to their duties with grim resolve. The great city had become a trap, and for hundreds of thousands of people the gates had slammed shut. For those left behind, caught in this seething cauldron of disease, hope became a commodity scarcer than clean water, and they turned, as desperate people always do, to the healers. But 17th century medicine, when faced with bubonic plague, was like a child with a stick trying to fight a giant. It was based almost entirely on theories handed down from ancient times, chiefly those of Galen, a 2nd century Greek physician. The core idea was that the body was governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was the result of an imbalance between them. But for the plague, the dominant theory was even more primitive: the miasma theory. It held that disease was caused by miasmas, or clouds of foul, poisonous air, which came from decaying matter, swamps, and corpses. The plague, therefore, was not passed from person to person, but was breathed in from the air itself. This fundamental belief dictated nearly every public health measure and personal remedy. If the air was poisoned, the logical solution was to purify it. City authorities ordered bonfires to be lit at street corners, burning day and night, filling the already heavy air with the acrid smoke of wood and tar. Inside their homes, people burned anything with a strong scent: juniper, frankincense, sulfur. They clutched pomanders, small metal balls filled with aromatic spices like cloves, nutmeg, and ambergris, holding them to their noses whenever they ventured outside. The irony, of course, was that the smoke may well have deterred the fleas, but for entirely the wrong reasons. The smell itself was believed to be the protective measure, not its effect on a disease vector that no one knew existed. Into this landscape of fear and olfactory confusion stepped a figure who has become the grim symbol of the age: the plague doctor. His iconic outfit was not a piece of theatrical costume, but an early terrifying piece of personal protective equipment designed entirely around the miasma theory. Picture him, a man cloaked from head to toe in a long coat of leather or waxed canvas, the smooth surface intended to prevent miasmas from sticking to it. He wore leather gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, often also of leather, and high boots. But the centerpiece, the most unsettling part, was the mask, a bird-like mask with a beak half a foot long, with glass lenses for the eyes. This beak was not for frightening, but acted as a primitive respirator. It was stuffed with a mixture of intensely aromatic herbs and spices: mint, cloves, camphor, laudanum, sometimes soaked in vinegar. The idea was that by breathing through this protective potpourri, the doctor would filter out the deadly air. Completing the ensemble, he carried a long wooden cane which allowed him to examine patients, push aside their clothing, or even take their pulse without having to make direct physical contact. It also served to keep the desperate at a distance. The reality of these doctors, however, rarely matched the imposing image. The most reputable and experienced physicians like Thomas Wharton had fled with their wealthy clients. Those who stayed and were hired by the city to treat the sick were often second-rate doctors, young men trying to establish themselves, or in some cases individuals with no real medical training at all who saw opportunity in catastrophe. Their job was less to cure and more to count. They would travel the parishes, confirming diagnosis and logging the numbers of the dead for the official records. Their treatments when they were attempted were brutal and ineffective. Rooted in the same humoral tradition, the standard treatment was bloodletting, either by opening a vein or applying leeches with the idea of removing the bad humours from the body. For the painful swollen buboes in the groin, neck or armpits, the procedure was to lance them, cutting into the lymph node to drain the pus. Often they would apply a paste made from anything from pigeon droppings to roasted onions to draw out the poison. These procedures, incredibly painful and performed in unsanitary conditions, often only succeeded in weakening the patient further, introducing new infections and hastening their death. Dr. George Thompson, one of the few physicians who stayed and wrote of his experiences, even conducted an autopsy on a plague body, an act of scientific bravery in an age of superstitious terror. He nearly died for it. For the common Londoner, with no access even to these dubious professionals, the market was flooded with desperate remedies and quacks. Newspapers and posters pasted on walls advertised miracle potions and protective charms. There was Dr. Goddard's plague water, the anti-pestilential pill, and endless antidotes. These concoctions often contained harmless ingredients like herbs and spices, but some were truly dangerous, including mercury and arsenic in small doses. People would hang bags of arsenic around their necks, believing it would draw the poison from their bodies. They swallowed powdered unicorn horn, usually narwhal tusk. One of the strangest remedies involved holding the plucked backside of a living hen against the buboes until the hen died, in the belief that the bird would draw out the disease. Tobacco, a relatively new product, was hailed as a powerful preventative. Everyone, even young children, was encouraged to smoke. At the prestigious Eton School, it is said that boys were flogged if they were caught without their pipe. Quacks made a fortune from human desperation. They stood on street corners, selling bottles of coloured liquid and promising immortality for a few shillings. They exploited the belief that the plague was divine punishment, selling amulets inscribed with prayers or Kabbalistic symbols. And the people, seeing no other option, bought. They bought the potions, they wore the charms, and they smoked the tobacco, all in a futile effort to ward off an invisible enemy they did not understand. The medicine of 1665 was not a science. It was a blend of guesswork, tradition, and superstition. Against the relentless force of Yersinia pestis, it offered no more protection than a simple charm whispered in the dark. And the darkness was deepening. The grand theories failed. The potions were useless. The bonfires filled the air with smoke, but did not stop the tide of death. But what did it feel like? What was it like to walk those emptying streets, to breathe that air thick with fear and smoke, and to watch your city, your world fall apart day by day? To answer that, we look not to the medical treatises or the Lord Mayor's proclamations. We look to the private meticulous writings of a man named Samuel Pepys. Pepys was neither a king nor a doctor. He was something far more useful to history, a tireless observer and a mid-level bureaucrat with an insatiable curiosity. As clerk of the Acts to the Navy Board, he was an administrator, a man of figures and logistics. But in private, in the pages of his diary, written in a secret shorthand code, he was a chronicler of his own life and the tumultuous times in which he lived. His diary was not meant for publication. It was for him alone, and that is why it is so honest, so vivid, and so profoundly human. Through his eyes, we see the plague seep into the city's consciousness. In late April of 1665, he notes with almost casual concern the first news of the plague in Drury Lane. By May, his tone grows more sombre, mentioning that the plague is much in town. By June 7th, the danger has become personal and terrifying. He writes, "This day, much against my will, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy upon us written there, the official symbol of infection with his own eyes. And the shock is palpable even across the centuries. The reality of forced quarantine, of entire families being sealed into their own homes to die, had materialized on his daily path." Pepys was a pragmatic man. His first concern was for the safety of his family. In early July, he made the difficult decision to send his wife Elizabeth along with his mother and their staff away from the city to Woolwich, where the Navy Board had facilities. He remained behind with only a few servants at his home on Seething Lane near the Tower of London. His work was too important to abandon. The Royal Navy was at war with the Dutch, and ships needed to be supplied, sailors paid, and the administration had to continue even as the world fell apart. His diary becomes a record of a dual life. On one hand, the routine of naval business, the ever-dwindling board meetings, the dealings with contractors. On the other, the constant effort of navigating a deadly city. His entries from August and September, the peak of the epidemic, are extraordinarily vivid. He describes the eerie silence that fell over London. On August 16th, he writes, "But Lord, how empty the streets are and melancholy, so that in this warm day I am not able to see 20 persons walking." Grass, he notes with astonishment, was beginning to grow in the streets of Whitehall. The only sound that broke the silence was the incessant tolling of church bells, each one marking another death. And at night, the rattle of the dead carts and the cry of "Bring out your dead." Pepys, a sociable man who loved the theatre, music, and taverns, found himself in a forced isolation. He grew paranoid about contagion. He writes of his reluctance to handle letters or money. He bought tobacco, though he disliked it, and chewed it as a preventative measure. It put me into a bad feeling of it, he muses, weighing the distaste against the fear. Yet he did not hide away completely. His duty forced him to move about the city, and his observations are sharp and heartbreaking. One day he sees a poor waterman rowing alone on the Thames, weeping for the loss of his entire family. Another time, on his way to a meeting, he comes upon a man on the street carrying the small body of his own child wrapped in a blanket, taking him to a plague pit because he could not afford a coffin or a bearer. These moments of personal tragedy, witnessed by chance, give a human face to the overwhelming statistics of the bills of mortality. Pepys also documents the small acts of life that go on. He is still concerned with his finances, with his career advancement, with his collection of books and his cellar of wine, even in the midst of the plague. He finds time to note a pretty dress or enjoy a good meal. This normality juxtaposed with the surrounding horror is what makes his diary so powerful. It reminds us that even in the worst catastrophes, life with all its trivialities and worries continues until it doesn't. Pepys is a remarkable guide because he is flawed. He is at times brave, attending his duties in a nearly empty office. At other times he is paralyzed by fear, hurrying home at the sight of someone who looks unwell. He is conscious of his own mortality. In early September, believing he might not survive, he draws up his will, ensuring his affairs are in order. A man, he writes, cannot be too well prepared for death, but he did survive. As the weather cooled in the autumn, the numbers began to fall. In October, Pepys notes with cautious optimism that the plague is abating exceedingly. The exodus slowly reverses, and by winter, the city begins to breathe again. The bells toll less frequently. The cry of the buriers fades into memory. Through the eyes of Samuel Pepys, we not only see the timeline of the plague, but we feel its pulse, the creeping terror, the desolate peak, and the slow, faltering tide of relief. His diary is an intimate window into a year when London faced its own annihilation, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and to the meticulous accounting of a man who simply could not stop writing it all down. As July surrendered to its own suffocating heat, the city of London began to choke. The air, already thick with coal smoke, and the waste of the Thames took on a new quality, an almost tangible weight, laden not only with humidity, but with a silent, omnipresent dread. The spring exodus had become a summer stampede, but for the hundreds of thousands who remained, trapped by poverty, duty, or simple resignation, the world had shrunk to the confines of their own parish, then their own street, and finally their own cross-marked house. It was the beginning of the Great Peak, the height of the pestilence, a descent into a statistical hell that would be made real in the cold, methodical figures published each Thursday by the Company of Parish Clerks. They were called the Bills of Mortality. Born a century earlier as an early warning system, they had become the weekly pulse of the city's agony. Each week, the clerks from each of the 130 parishes in and around London would compile their lists. Men called searchers, often elderly women who believed themselves immune or were simply too desperate to refuse the work, would go from house to house to verify the cause of death. Their diagnosis, often little more than a guess, informed by the presence of the dreaded buboes, were funneled into a central registry. And every Thursday, the public could purchase for a penny the printed sheet that summarized the previous week's harvest of death. At first, people had watched them with a morbid curiosity, tracking the plague's advance as one tracks an enemy army on a distant map. But by July of 1665, the enemy was not at the gates. It was in the next bedroom. Reading the bills became a ritual of terror. The week ending July 18th, the numbers took a leap that chilled the blood of those who could still feel. 1,089 deaths attributed directly to the plague. The following week, 1,143. The last week of July, 2,010. And everyone knew with a nauseating certainty that the real numbers were far higher. The searchers could be bribed to record a death as consumption or spotted fever to spare the entire family from being locked in. Sects like the Quakers, who often buried their own dead in secret to avoid regulations, went uncounted. The true figure was a shadow far larger than the number printed on the paper. August arrived with no relief. The heat lingered, thick and oppressive. The sky rarely broke. It was a month of silence and bells, the usual din of London, the rumble of carts on cobblestones, the cries of street vendors, the hammering from workshops had all faded away. In its place was a heavy quiet, broken only by the weeping that filtered through boarded-up windows, the occasional bark of a stray dog, and the ceaseless tolling of church bells. One bell for each death, a constant toll that served as the soundtrack to the apocalypse. Samuel Pepys, the hard-working diarist of London life, wrote in mid-August, "But to see how sad a sight it is to see the streets empty and bells continually tolling. I was forced to buy some roll tobacco to smell and chew, which took away the worry. A small defence, an aromatic amulet against a miasma of death." The August bills of mortality told a story of exponential acceleration. The first full week, over 3,000 dead from the plague. The second, 4,000. By the end of the month, the weekly figures surpassed 6,000 souls. The outparishes, those outside the old Roman city walls, were hit the hardest. Places like Stepney, Holborn, Cripplegate and Southwark. Labyrinths of narrow alleys and overcrowded tenements where the poor were packed together became epicentres of annihilation. In the parish of St Giles in the Fields where it had all begun, the deaths were so numerous that the parish's administrative machinery simply collapsed. The living were too busy, too sick, or too frightened to count the dead. And then came September. If July was fear and August was despair, September was the abyss. The plague, now unchecked, raged with a fury that defied comprehension. The week of September 19th marked the city's lowest point. That Thursday's bill of mortality listed 7,165 confirmed plague deaths. 7,165. The total deaths from all causes that week was 8,197. In a city whose population had been reduced to perhaps a quarter of its normal size, it was a statistical carnage. It is almost impossible to imagine the reality behind that figure. More than 1,000 people a day, a Londoner dying every minute and a half. The Lord Mayor, Sir John Lawrence, one of the few men of authority who bravely remained at his post, issued increasingly desperate orders, attempting to maintain a semblance of order in a city dissolving into chaos and disease. Public gatherings were forbidden, streets were ordered to be cleansed, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a bucket of water. The plague had its own momentum, its own terrible logic. In the empty streets, grass began to grow between the cobblestones. Houses with the Red Cross and the words, "Lord have mercy upon us," painted on their doors were now the norm, not the exception. Pepys observed that the only people moving through the streets were physicians, priests, and the men who tended to the grim business of death. The city had become a vast hospice. Every home was a potential hospital ward, every family its own nurses and undertakers. The scale of the mortality had overwhelmed the city's ability to process it, not just emotionally, but physically. 7,000 bodies a week. The number is so vast it becomes an abstraction, a statistic on a yellowed page. But each unit in that figure was a person, a life extinguished in fever and pain. And each person once dead became a logistical problem, a problem that had to be solved in the darkness with the grim efficiency born of overwhelming necessity. The choreography of despair began with a knock on the door. The searchers, as mentioned, were the first link in this chain. Often poor widows, these women would enter the homes where death had paid a visit, carrying long wands to maintain their distance and a handkerchief soaked in vinegar or wormwood pressed to their nose. Their job was to confirm the cause of death, a quick examination for the telltale tokens or buboes, a question to the grieving family, and the diagnosis was made, a shilling for their trouble and an incalculable risk to their own life. Then the parish clerk was notified, and the name was added to the list that would be sent for the compilation of the bills of mortality. But the body remained. The law, reinforced by the Lord Mayor's orders, dictated that the bodies of plague victims could not be brought out of the house during daylight. It was believed that the hot sun could release the poisonous miasmas from the corpse and spread them through the air. Thus, families were forced to live with their dead, sometimes for more than a day, waiting for the sound that everyone in London had come to dread more than any other. It came at dusk. First, the distant squeal of an ungreased cartwheel, then the slow, heavy tread of a horse, and finally, the call. A monotone, emotionless voice echoing in the silent alleys. Bring out your dead. It was the cry of the corpse collectors, the bearers, men who, like the searchers, were often the poorest of the poor or criminals, offered the job in exchange for a pardon. They moved in small teams, often drinking to dull the horror and the stench. Their arrival was a signal of finality. Doors would open and bodies often wrapped only in a sheet, or the clothes they died in were brought out and unceremoniously placed in the open cart. Sometimes family members performed the task. Other times, too sick or weak themselves, They would simply point from a window and the bearers would enter to do their work. The dead cart was a vision from a nightmare, a simple farm wagon pulled by a single horse that slowly filled as it moved along its parish route. Bodies of men, women, and children piled one on top of the other in a tangle of pale limbs. The cart driver, often sitting in silence, his face covered and a whip in his hand, had become the Karen of the Thames, ferrying not souls, but the husks they had left behind. As the summer wore on and the deaths mounted, a single cart was no longer enough. Larger parishes employed several, working through the night in a ceaseless effort to cleanse the city of its dead before sunrise. The final destination of this macabre cargo was the last and most profound insult to the customs and rites of the age. In normal times, a burial was a solemn, dignified affair. A service in the church, a procession to the parish churchyard, the body properly interred in a coffin in a family plot. But at the height of the plague, this was an impossible luxury. Churchyards filled up in a matter of weeks. The consecrated ground was exhausted. There was not enough wood for coffins, not enough gravediggers for individual graves, not enough time for funeral services. The solution was brutally pragmatic. The mass grave, or as it became known, the plague pit. These were enormous trenches dug in haste in churchyards or on undeveloped plots of land on the city's outskirts. The most famous and one of the largest was at Aldgate, dug in the churchyard of St. Botolph's parish. Daniel Defoe, who wrote his A Journal of the Plague Year decades later, but based it on eyewitness accounts and records, described its size with chilling precision, some 40 feet long, 16 feet wide, and as much as 20 feet deep. At night, the dead carts from the surrounding parishes would arrive at these pits. What followed was a process of industrial disposal. The bearers, using long hooks and pikes, would simply tip the cart or drag the bodies out, letting them tumble into the darkness of the pit. There was no ceremony, no prayers, no names read, only the dull thud of bodies hitting the bottom, or landing upon those already there. When a layer of bodies covered the floor, gravediggers would spread a layer of earth and quicklime over them to hasten decomposition, and it was hoped to purify the air. And then the next night the process would repeat. Layer upon layer of London's anonymous citizens reduced to raw material in a grim accounting. One eyewitness, a sexton who survived, recounted how in a single September night, his team buried 1,114 bodies in the Aldgate pit. The scale was such that the excavated earth from the pit formed a mountain beside it, and each day the mountain shrank as it was used to cover the dead, while the pit inexorably filled. These pits were open wounds in the earth and in the city's psyche, a visible and fetid reminder that the rules of life, and more importantly of death, had been suspended. The dignity of the individual had dissolved into the necessity of the mass. Identity was lost in the pile. For the living, the thought that this would be their end, an anonymous burial in a common pit without rite or remembrance, was often a terror as great as the disease itself. When the physical world falls apart so completely, when the structures of daily life, work, community, even the rituals of death evaporate, the mind and soul are forced to find an anchor in the storm. For the Londoners of 1665, the summer and autumn were not just a public health crisis. They were a profound psychological and spiritual crisis. The city became a realm ruled by two twin and often contradictory monarchs, fear and faith. Fear was the atmosphere one breathed more pervasive than the coal smoke or the stench of sickness. It was a primal animal fear of sudden invisible death, but it also branched out into more complex and social forms. Paranoia became the currency of human interaction. A neighbor coughing across the street became a mortal threat. A friend not seen for a few days was presumed dead. The simple act of buying a loaf of bread could feel like a game of Russian roulette. People walked in the middle of the street to avoid passing too close to doorways. Physical contact, the handshake, the embrace vanished entirely. Every other human being became an island of suspicion. This fear needed an object, a face to blame for the calamity. And as is so often the case in times of panic, scapegoats were sought. At first, the anger was directed at animals. The authorities, acting on the mistaken belief that dogs and cats were the primary carriers of the plague, ordered a mass slaughter. Special dog catchers were hired to roam the city, killing any domestic animal they found. An estimated 40,000 dogs and perhaps as many as 200,000 cats were exterminated. It was a catastrophic decision. With their natural predators eliminated, the population of black rats, the true carriers of the infected fleas, exploded. In their attempt to fight the plague, the authorities had, ironically, created the perfect conditions for it to thrive. Suspicion also fell on fellow humans. Foreigners, particularly the Dutch and French, with whom England was either at war or in tense relations, were the subject of rumours and accusations. They were said to be poisoning the wells or deliberately spreading the disease. But the deepest and most pervasive blame turned inward. The plague to the 17th century mind was not merely a disease. It was a divine judgment, a punishment from an angry God for the sins of the city. London, seen as a modern Sodom, a nest of vice, greed, and religious disagreement, was getting its just deserts. Proclaimers and prophets of doom, once fringe figures, now found a captive audience. They roamed the streets, their eyes wild with fervour, shouting warnings of hellfire and calling the city to repentance. Men like Solomon Eagle, who was said to walk naked through the city with a brazier of burning coals on his head, crying, "Woe unto us," became part of the urban landscape of terror. In the face of this overwhelming sense of divine condemnation, the other great response was a desperate turn towards faith. If God was punishing London, then perhaps God could also save it. While many clergy of the established Church of England fled alongside their wealthy patrons, a significant number stayed, risking their lives to offer comfort to their decimated flocks. And the people flocked to the churches. In one of the cruelest paradoxes of the plague, the very places of worship where people gathered to pray for deliverance became some of the most deadly hotbeds of contagion. Imagine the scene: a church like St. Giles Cripplegate, dark and crowded, hundreds of parishioners packed into the pews, sweating in the summer heat, listening to a sermon on the wrath and mercy of God. The air is thick, heavy with the smells of incense, sweat, and fear. And in that crowd there are people in the early stages of the disease, coughing, releasing the pathogen into the air, or with infected fleas hopping from their clothes to their neighbours. People came seeking salvation and unwittingly found infection. The faith that brought them to church became the vehicle of their own destruction. Yet they kept coming. The need for solace, for ritual, for a sense of community amid the forced isolation was too strong. The sermons of the time reflected the desperation. They spoke of the end of days, of the need to examine one's conscience, to prepare for an imminent death. For many, the only hope left was not to survive the plague on earth, but to secure the salvation of their soul in the hereafter. This religious fervour also opened a door for the dissenting or nonconformist preachers, those who had been silenced and persecuted after the restoration of the monarchy. With many Anglican pulpits empty, these brave men came out of the woodwork. Baptists, Quakers, and Presbyterians, who saw the plague as a vindication of their warnings against the corruption of the established church, began to preach openly in the streets or in abandoned churches. They became heroes to many of the poor who felt abandoned by both the state and the official church. Men like Thomas Vincent, a Presbyterian preacher, became famous for their passionate sermons and their refusal to leave the city, walking among the sick and dying to offer prayer and comfort. And so the city was caught in this terrible dichotomy. In one house, a family clung to superstition, hanging amulets on their doors and distrusting their neighbour's shadow. In the house next door, another family knelt in constant prayer, commending their souls to God. And in the street, the dead cart passed to collect the dead from both houses, making no distinction. Fear and faith danced a macabre waltz in the empty cobbled streets. Both were attempts to impose an order, a narrative onto a chaos that defied reason. Fear created rules of avoidance and blame. Faith offered a framework of sin and redemption. But the bacterium Yersinia pestis understood neither theology nor paranoia. It simply went on its way, indifferent to the prayers, the blame, and the endlessly tolling bells. A steady pulse marking the rhythm of the longest, darkest summer London would ever know. The height of the pestilence was a trial by fire that burned not just bodies, but souls, leaving the survivors in a transformed world. A landscape of silence and memory, where the ghosts of thousands walked beside them, as the August sun, relentless and copper-hued, hung over the rooftops of London, transforming the Thames into a ribbon of fetid vapour. Life for those trapped within the city had been reduced to a series of meticulous and repetitive rituals, a ballet of survival performed in the claustrophobic space of a few rooms. The grand narrative of the plague, with its overwhelming numbers and official edicts, faded into the background of a much more immediate and personal reality. How to secure the next day's bread without inviting death to your table. Survival was no longer a large-scale strategy. It was a domestic affair, a matter of locks, vinegar, and a trembling faith in the solidity of one's own walls. Securing food became the central act of each day, a silent drama that unfolded in thousands of homes. The markets, like Leadenhall or Cheapside, remained open, but they were potential death traps. They operated with a skeleton crew of merchants, often farmers from the surrounding counties who, driven by need or greed, ventured to the city gates. They did not enter fully. They would leave their goods at designated meeting points, like crossroads on the outskirts, where city middlemen or the bravest citizens would go to collect them. Money was a problem. Coins having passed through countless hands were seen as vectors of contagion. The solution was simple and medieval: vinegar. Buyers would drop their shillings and pence into bowls or jars filled with vinegar, hoping the acidic liquid would purge any trace of the plague. The seller, their face covered with a cloth soaked in the same liquid, would retrieve the coins with a pair of tongs. It was a contactless, dehumanized trade where every transaction was a gamble. For the wealthier families who had remained, the problem was delegated. A servant was sent out, often the youngest and most expendable, with a list and a pouch of coins. This servant became the weakest link in the household's defensive chain. Upon returning, they were subjected to a ritual of purification at the door. They were forced to strip, to wash their body with water and vinegar, and to put on clean clothes that had been left ready for them. The provisions they brought back were meticulously cleaned. Bread was passed over a flame. Vegetables were washed repeatedly. The clothes they had worn outside were submerged in boiling water or left to air out for days. It was a system built on fear and a rudimentary understanding of contamination. For the less fortunate, there were no servants to send. The head of the household, or whoever felt strongest or luckiest that day, had to venture out. The journey was an exercise in calculated paranoia. One walked down the center of the street as far as possible from doorways and windows. A handkerchief soaked in vinegar or a mixture of aromatic herbs was held against the nose and mouth. Tobacco became a popular preventative. It was believed that the smoke cleansed the tainted air, the famous miasma. Men, women, and even children learned to smoke, filling their lungs with acrid smoke in the hope that it would keep the pestilence at bay. Crossing paths with another person on a narrow street was a moment of unbearable tension. Both pedestrians would press themselves against opposite walls, holding their breath, their gaze fixed on the ground until the danger had passed. The sound of a distant cough was enough to make the heart race and one's pace quicken. Inside the home, confinement created its own kind of hell. The forced quarantine, the infamous shutting up of a house with a red cross painted on the door, was a death sentence for most. But even for those who isolated themselves voluntarily, the psychological pressure was immense. Families lived crowded together, breathing the same air, sharing the same fear. Every sneeze, every chill, every headache was analyzed with a feverish intensity. Was it a simple cold or the beginning of the end? Familial trust eroded under the weight of suspicion. A father would look at his child with a mixture of love and terror. The slightest sign of illness could turn a loved one into a mortal threat to everyone else. The days stretched into an oppressive monotony. With no work to go to, no social life, no entertainment beyond what could be improvised, time itself became an enemy. People prayed, read the Bible with a panic-renewed devotion, mended clothes, played cards, or simply sat by the window watching the emptiness of the street. The only interruption to the stillness was the creak of the dead cart's wheels and the driver's mournful cry, "Bring out your dead." That sound became the soundtrack of London in 1665, the constant reminder that the walls of one's home were a fragile defense, a mere membrane between one's small bubble of life and the ocean of death that surrounded it. People learned to measure the plague's advance by the frequency of the cart's passing. At first, once a day. At the peak of the epidemic, it seemed never to leave. Confinement was a torture of boredom and terror, where the greatest threat was not only outside, but could emerge at any moment from within your own family circle, or even from within your own body. In this landscape of fear and seclusion, the very structure of London society began to crumble, revealing both the worst of human nature and unexpected glimmers of order and resilience. With the king, the court, and most of the wealthy magistrates, lawyers, and clergymen having fled to the countryside, a power vacuum was created. London became a city under siege, not by a foreign army, but by an invisible enemy. And in this siege, the usual rules of civilized behavior became optional. Anarchy flourished in the cracks of a dying city. Crime grew more brazen and desperate. Looting was rampant. Houses marked with the Red Cross, whose occupants were dead or dying, were prime targets. Thieves, often immune from having survived the plague or simply too desperate to care, would force the locks in the dead of night. They took everything of value: silver, jewelry, fine clothes, even furniture. There were no police to stop them. The few remaining constables were overwhelmed, busy enforcing quarantines or overseeing the plague pits. Robbing the dead became an occupation. The searchers of the dead, the officials tasked with verifying and recording plague deaths, were notorious for emptying the pockets of corpses before officially declaring them dead. Perhaps the most infamous figure of this underworld was the plague nurse. In theory, they were women hired by the parish to care for the sick in the shut-up houses. In practice, many were predators. They were often poor women, widows, or destitute with little to lose. Locked in with a sick family, their power was absolute. Some would simply neglect their patients, ensuring the disease ran its fatal course so they could plunder the house once everyone was dead. Others were more direct. It was rumoured they would smother the sick with their pillows or administer remedies that hastened their end. One Daniel Defoe, writing years later, would recount chilling stories of these women who became angels of death for hire, stripping their victims of their last possessions while they were still warm. It was the ultimate betrayal to invite a caregiver into your home, only for her to become your executioner and heir. Charlatans and quacks also had their day. They sold infallible antidotes and miraculous waters at exorbitant prices. They were useless concoctions of herbs, wine, and sometimes more exotic and unpleasant ingredients. Desperate people bought anything that offered a sliver of hope. These fraudsters moved from parish to parish, one step ahead of the plague and the wrath of their defrauded customers, amassing a small fortune on the back of the general panic. But amidst this moral collapse, order did not disappear entirely. It clung to life, tenacious and grim, thanks to the efforts of a handful of men who chose not to flee. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir John Lawrence, and his council of aldermen were the anchor that kept the city from sinking completely into chaos. Lawrence, a man of iron resolve, remained at his post in the Guildhall, coordinating the city's response with a bureaucratic efficiency that was almost heroic under the circumstances. Their task was monumental. They had to maintain a minimal food supply, organize the collection of the dead, enforce the quarantines, and somehow pay the men who performed these horrific tasks. Tax revenues had plummeted. Lawrence and his men drew on their own fortunes and solicited donations from the nobles and merchants who had fled. With these funds, they kept a skeletal administration running. They paid the drivers of the dead carts, the watchmen who stood guard before infected houses, and the gravediggers who worked day and night at the plague pits. These frontline workers were the unsung heroes of the plague. They were poor men, often alcoholics, who took the jobs no one else wanted for a few shillings a day and the promise of food and drink. They were despised and feared by the populace, seen as bearers of death. Yet their work was essential. Without them, the bodies would have piled up in the streets, and the city would have drowned in its own dead. The system was not perfect. Corruption was common. Watchmen took bribes to allow people to escape from quarantined houses. The gravediggers were often drunk, but it worked just barely. There were also acts of extraordinary civic kindness. Neighbours who left food on the doorsteps of shutting families. Physicians like the notable Nathaniel Hodges who stayed to tend to the sick, knowing each visit could be their last. Clergymen who continued to give sermons in near-empty churches and visit the dying to offer last rites. These acts did not stop the plague, but they kept a flame of humanity alive in the darkest of hours. They showed that even as the social fabric tore, some threads refused to break. London in the summer of 1665 was not just a city of opportunists and thieves. It was also a city of stubborn bureaucrats, desperate labourers, and decent citizens who, faced with the apocalypse, simply chose to carry on with their jobs. The order they maintained was not elegant or just, but it was order nonetheless, a precarious bulwark against total anarchy. And so the city endured, suspended between law and chaos through the months of scorching heat. September was the apex of the horror. The weekly bill of mortality reached its peak, recording over 7,000 plague deaths in a single week. The stench of death was so thick, it was said you could taste it in the air. The plague pits like the one at Aldgate were filled to the brim. It seemed the city could bear no more, that the creaking, overburdened machinery of survival would finally break. And then something changed. It was not a divine miracle or a new remedy. It was something much simpler, much more mundane. It was the weather. In late September and early October, the air began to take on a different edge. The nights grew longer and colder. The oppressive blanket of summer heat began to lift, replaced by a cool breeze that swept through the empty streets. For the first time in months, people felt a chill that was not a symptom of the pestilent fever. Winter was coming. The narrative of the plague, which until then had been told through tolling bells and cries of town criers, began to change its tone. The source of this new hope was a simple grim document, the Bills of Mortality. Every Thursday, the list of the previous week's deaths was published, broken down by parish and by cause. For months, Londoners had awaited this report with dread, watching the numbers climb inexorably. But in the first week of October, for the first time, the total number of plague deaths fell slightly. It was a small drop, almost insignificant against the scale of the slaughter. Many dismissed it as a statistical anomaly, but the following week, the number dropped again, this time more noticeably, and the next, even more so. A pattern was established. The monstrous wave that had flooded London was beginning slowly but perceptibly to recede. Hope and almost forgotten emotion began to timidly return. People spoke in whispers. Could it be that the worst was over? They did not understand why. To them it was the work of providence, a sign that God was finally abating his wrath. Or perhaps the countless purification bonfires the Lord Mayor had ordered to be lit in the streets were working, burning the poisonous miasma from the air. The truth, of course, was much smaller and more biological, hidden in the fur of rats and the digestive systems of fleas. The Great Plague was a warm weather disease. The bacterium Yersinia pestis thrives in the heat. Its primary vector, the oriental rat flea Xenophila chiopis, also depends on warm temperatures for its life cycle. During the summer, the flea's reproductive cycle is fast and efficient. A female flea can lay hundreds of eggs which hatch into larvae and mature into adults in a matter of weeks. When the bacterium infects the flea, it multiplies in its gut, creating a blockage. The flea, starved and desperate, bites its host, a rat or a human, frenetically, regurgitating thousands of bacteria into the wound with each attempt to feed. This biological mechanism is a terribly effective disease transmission machine, and in the heat of the summer of 1665, it was running at full capacity. But the cold changed everything. As temperatures dropped below 10 to 12 degrees Celsius, this life cycle slowed dramatically. The flea's metabolism grew slower. Its reproductive cycle lengthened, reducing the number of new fleas. And most importantly, the Yersinia pestis bacterium ceased to multiply as effectively in the flea's gut. The blockage that made it so ravenous and dangerous often failed to form. An infected flea in winter was far less capable of transmitting the disease than its summer counterpart. The rats, the disease's main reservoir, also became less active, seeking shelter from the cold and reducing their contact with humans. So unbeknownst to anyone, the arrival of winter was disarming the enemy on a microscopic level. Every degree the temperature dropped was another nail in the epidemic's coffin. The first frost of November, which coated the streets in a thin white rime, was the killing blow. The number of new cases plummeted. The bills of mortality for November and December told a story of almost miraculous relief. From thousands of deaths per week, the numbers fell to hundreds and then to dozens. For the survivors, this frigid respite was like waking from a nightmare. Slowly, with infinite caution, doors began to open. People stepped out into the streets, blinking in a pale winter sun. They looked at one another from a distance with a mixture of suspicion and solidarity. They were strangers bound by a shared trauma. Every face they saw was that of someone who, like them, had won history's most macabre lottery. The city they found was a ghostly place. The silence was still thick, broken only by the wind whistling through the alleyways. Grass grew between the cobblestones of the main streets, which for months had been barely trodden. Many houses stood empty, their windows broken, their doors hanging from their hinges. They were silent monuments to the families that had vanished. But there was life. Smoke once again rose from some chimneys. The markets, though still sparsely stocked, began to see a gradual return of activity. Those who had fled began to return in a slow trickle, finding a city changed forever. The fear was not entirely gone. People still avoided physical contact, and a red cross on a door still inspired an instinctual terror. The plague still claimed sporadic victims through the winter, but it was no longer an uncontrolled wildfire. It was a dying fire, leaving only smouldering embers. Winter brought no joy or celebrations. It brought a somber, exhausted calm. The relief of survival was tinged with the immensity of grief. Nearly everyone had lost someone: a spouse, a child, a sibling, a friend, a neighbour. London was a city of ghosts, populated by the living who were haunted by the dead. But for the first time in nearly a year, they could look to the future, not with optimism, but with the simple, profound gratitude of knowing that they would most likely have a future to look upon. The cold had cleansed the air, not of the miasma they feared, but of the true vector of their misery. The icy breath of winter had been their salvation, a respite that would allow them to count their losses, bury their dead one last time, and begin very slowly to rebuild their shattered world. The winter of 1665, that long and frigid respite, had begun to yield. As the frosted grass of the Finsbury and Moorfields surrendered to a timid green, the city of London embarked upon a sombre and monumental task, the accounting of its dead. It was an arithmetic of sorrow, an attempt to trace the contours of an emptiness felt in every silent street, in every shuttered workshop, in every house where a red cross was still visible on the door, faded but not forgotten. The primary tool for this macabre census was the Bills of Mortality. These documents, published weekly, were the city's official pulse, a record that sought to keep count of the departing souls and the causes of their departure. The system had existed for decades, managed by the Worshipful Company of Parish Clerks, a guild that in theory ensured a methodical register of life and death. In practice, the system was a work of astonishing, optimistic inefficiency. The process began at the street level, with figures known as searchers of the dead. They were generally older women, often poor and illiterate, appointed by the parish to a task that no one else desired. When a death was reported, one of these women would go to the home, examine the body, often in an advanced state of decay, and render a judgment on the cause of death. Their diagnosis was based on folklore, on superficial observation, and frequently on the persuasion of the grieving family. They received a small sum for each body inspected, an incentive to continue working in the worst imaginable conditions. Yet there was also a powerful counter-incentive to diagnose the plague, meant the immediate shutting up of the house, the forced quarantine of all its inhabitants for 40 days. For a family that had already lost a loved one, this was a second blow, a sentence of economic ruin and terrifying isolation. And so, a small coin, a desperate plea, a dram of gin was often enough for the cause of death to be recorded as something less troublesome. The records of the time are a testament to this diagnostic creativity. People died of putrid fever, of consumption, of dropsy, or of a conveniently vague stopping. Some entries bordered on the poetic griping in the gut's teeth, a category that encompassed any childhood ailment, or my personal favourite, frighted, which presumably referred to a death from sheer terror. During the height of the plague, these evasions multiplied. The parish clerks who compiled the reports from the searchers were often silent accomplices in this pious fiction. The result was a systematic and deliberate undercounting. When the Company of Parish Clerks published its final report for the plague year, the official number of deaths attributed to it was 68,596. A dreadful number to be sure, but one that paled in comparison to the reality felt in the empty streets. Modern demographers, like astute observers of the time, such as the pioneering statistician John Grant, knew this figure was merely the tip of the iceberg. Grant, years before the Great Plague, had already written about the inaccuracies of the bills, noting how the figures for certain diseases were inflated or deflated according to fashion or fear. In 1665, fear was everything. The official count for a start only included baptized members of the Church of England. It excluded thousands of dissenters, Quakers, Anabaptists, Baptists, and of course the city's small but significant Jewish population. They buried their own dead in their own grounds, far from the eyes of the parish clerks. Their losses did not feature in the city's ledger. Furthermore, the system utterly collapsed at the peak of the summer. In weeks when more than 7,000 people were dying, the bureaucracy simply could not keep pace. Bodies were thrown into common plague pits with no record at all. Entire families perished inside their sealed homes, discovered weeks later. Their deaths never individually tallied. And then there were those who fled and died outside the city limits in the surrounding towns and villages. Their deaths added to local statistics, not London's. By cross-referencing this data, analysing burial records from dissenters and applying statistical models to the spikes in mortality from other causes, historians have arrived at a much more chilling figure. The most conservative estimate places the true number of dead above 100,000 souls in a city whose total population before the plague was estimated at around 460,000. This means that nearly 1 in every 4 Londoners perished in less than a year. It was not a simple epidemic. It was a local extinction event, a brutal pruning of the population that left a demographic scar which would take generations to heal. The silence that had settled over London in the autumn of 1665 was not just the absence of noise. It was the palpable echo of 100,000 voices that were no more. The accounting was finished, but the true cost was only just beginning to be understood. The city, though deeply wounded, began to breathe again in the early months of 1666. The intense cold of the winter had worked wonders, slowing the transmission of the disease to a near standstill. With the arrival of spring, those who had fled began to return. King Charles II and his court moved back to Whitehall in February, a signal that the worst had passed. Trade slowly resumed. Carts began to clatter once more over the cobblestones, and a fragile, almost fearful sense of normality settled upon the streets. The plague had not vanished entirely. Sporadic cases were still reported through the summer, but it was no longer the apocalyptic beast that had devoured the city. London had survived. It had faced the darkness, and though maimed, had emerged into the light. The people believed the trial was over. They were wrong. The city was about to face a second ordeal, one not of disease, but of fire. The summer of 1666 was long, hot, and dry. London's timber-framed buildings, many of them centuries old, were as dry as tinder. On Sunday the 2nd of September, shortly after midnight, in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, belonging to a man named Thomas Farriner, the king's baker, a forgotten ember in the oven sparked to life. Farriner's house, like most in medieval London, was a fire trap waiting to happen. Built of a timber frame filled with wattle and daub and coated in pitch to make it waterproof, the fire quickly found fuel in the stored flour and firewood, and within minutes, the bakery was an inferno. Fanned by a strong easterly wind, the flames leaped from the bakery to a nearby hay store in the yard of the Star Inn, and from there, the catastrophe became unstoppable. The Great Fire of London was not simply an accident. It was the inevitable consequence of the city's very structure. The streets were narrow and labyrinthine, designed for horse-drawn carts, not for logic or safety. The upper floors of the houses, in a style known as jettying, overhung the street below, so that in some alleyways the roofs on either side almost touched, creating a perfect wind tunnel for the flames. The wharves along the Thames were packed with warehouses containing highly flammable materials: oil, tar, brandy, coal, and gunpowder. It was an urban landscape designed to burn. The initial response was a disaster of indecision and bureaucracy. The Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was woken and brought to the scene. His assessment, now infamous, was one of monumental disdain. "Pish, a woman might piss it out," he is said to have muttered before returning to his bed. That phrase, whether apocryphal or not, encapsulated the paralysis of the authorities. 17th century firefighting methods were woefully inadequate. They consisted of leather buckets passed from hand to hand, and small hand pumps that squirted a negligible stream of water against a sea of fire. The only effective known technique was the creation of fire breaks by demolishing buildings in the fire's path. But this required decisive authority and a willingness to destroy private property, something Bloodworth and the city aldermen were loath to do, fearful of the lawsuits that would follow. It was the diarist Samuel Pepys who, seeing the scale of the disaster from his home, took the initiative. He rode down the Thames to Whitehall to alert the king personally. Charles II, showing more decisiveness than the mayor, instantly granted his authority to pull down any house necessary and put his brother, the Duke of York, in command of the operations. But by then the fire had a life of its own. It surged westward, consuming everything in its path. The noise was deafening. The crackle of timber, the crash of beams, the shouts of people, and the dull roar of collapsing buildings. The heat was so intense that the lead from the roofs of churches melted and ran in silver streams down the streets. St. Paul's Cathedral, the Gothic heart of the city, thought to be fireproof with its stone walls, became a death trap. Booksellers had stored their valuable volumes in the crypt, believing it to be the safest place in London. But when the wooden scaffolding surrounding the cathedral for repairs caught fire, the roof collapsed and the flames breached the crypt, turning thousands of books into a paper furnace. The fire raged for 4 days. When it was finally contained, thanks to a change in the wind's direction and the mass use of gunpowder from the Tower of London to create effective fire breaks, the heart of the medieval city had been erased from the map. More than 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, the Royal Exchange, the Guildhall, and the majestic St. Paul's lay in smoking ruins. Almost immediately, a powerful and enduring myth arose that the Great Fire had been a blessing in disguise, a divine purge that had cleansed London of the plague once and for all. It is an attractive narrative full of symmetry and poetic justice. And like all good myths, it contains a kernel of truth wrapped in a great fallacy. The truth is that the fire did destroy the poorest, most overcrowded and unsanitary neighbourhoods of the city. the very areas where the plague had wreaked havoc. The flames incinerated the flea-infested wooden hovels and killed countless rats that hid in cellars and sewers. In that sense, the fire performed an urban clearance of unprecedented brutality. However, to credit it with ending the Great Plague is to ignore the timeline. As we have seen, the epidemic was already in steep decline by September 1666. The mortality rate had returned to near normal levels. The cold of the previous winter had been the plague's true executioner, interrupting the life cycle of the fleas. The fire, if anything, was the coup de grace to an already dying enemy. Its true legacy was not the purification of disease, but the destruction of a world. The old London, the London of Shakespeare and the Tudors, had turned to ash. Upon its ruins, a new city would have to be born. From the ashes of the medieval city rose an unprecedented opportunity, a blank slate upon which to redesign the greatest metropolis in Europe. In the weeks after the fire, while the ground was still warm and the air smelled of soot, the architects, thinkers and visionaries of England saw their moment. Grand plans for a radical rebuilding were put forward. The most famous was that of Christopher Wren, a brilliant professor of astronomy at Oxford, with a prodigious talent for architecture. His plan for London was a masterpiece of Baroque logic, a city of wide avenues radiating from monumental squares with churches sited at focal points to create imposing vistas. It was a design inspired by Paris and Rome, a London of order, grandeur and reason, designed to ease traffic and promote health. John Evelyn, a scholar and diarist, friend of Pepys, proposed a similar plan, as did the scientist Robert Hooke. They all dreamed of a city reborn, geometric and fire-resistant. These plans were magnificent, they were rational, and they were utterly doomed to fail. The reason for their failure was not a lack of vision, but the stubborn reality of private property and English law. To impose a grid of straight streets upon the maze of the old city, the state would have had to carry out a massive compulsory purchase of land. Every merchant, every homeowner would have seen their small plot absorbed into a grand new boulevard. The legal structure and political mindset of 17th century England simply would not allow it. Property rights were deeply entrenched, and King Charles II, who had already lived through a civil war and exile, had neither the political capital nor the desire to wage a legal battle with thousands of his subjects. Furthermore, there was an overriding economic need to rebuild quickly. London was the commercial engine of the nation, and every day its wharves and markets lay in ruins. The entire country suffered. And so instead of a Baroque utopia, the rebuilding largely followed the old medieval street plan. Property owners rebuilt their homes and shops on the foundations of the old ones. The labyrinth in essence was preserved. However, this does not mean that lessons were not learned. Parliament acted with remarkable speed, passing the Rebuilding Act of 1667. This was a landmark in the history of urban planning, not for its grandeur, but for its pragmatism. The Act laid down a strict and detailed building code. Timber was forbidden as the primary building material for exteriors. All new houses had to be built of brick or stone, creating a city of red and grey hues instead of the previous dark timber. House types were standardized, classified according to their location on main streets, side streets, or alleys with the thickness of walls and the height of ceilings specified for each type. Streets were widened, and the practice of jettying, those overhanging upper floors, was banned forever, allowing more light and air to reach the ground level. These regulations were not based on an understanding of germ theory, which was still 2 centuries away. The prevailing belief was still that disease spread through miasmas or bad air. But the reforms born of a fear of fire had fortunate sanitary consequences. A city of brick and stone was less hospitable to rats than one of wood and thatch. Wider streets and houses without overhangs improved air circulation and exposure to sunlight, which helped to reduce the damp and filth where bacteria could thrive. Efforts were made to improve sanitation, such as building new drains and paving more streets. Ironically, in trying to protect itself from one disaster, London inadvertently made itself more resilient to another. The Great Plague of 1665 was in fact the last major epidemic of bubonic plague in England. While the fire was not the direct cause of its end, the city that rose from its ashes was structurally less vulnerable to its return. Added to this was a subtle but crucial ecological shift. The gradual replacement of the black rat, Rattus rattus, an agile climber that lived in close proximity to humans in attics and roofs, by the larger, more aggressive brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, which preferred to live in sewers further away from direct human contact. The legacy of these two twin catastrophes was etched not only into the physical fabric of the city, but also into its collective memory. To commemorate the fire, Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke designed the monument, an imposing Doric column standing 202 feet tall near the northern end of London Bridge. Its height is not arbitrary. If laid on its side, its top would point to the exact spot on Pudding Lane where the fire began. For a time, the monument also served as a scientific laboratory, but its primary purpose has always been as a reminder, a stone scar on the city's skyline. The plague, for its part, left a more intangible but equally profound legacy. It became a benchmark in London's history, a yardstick against which future disasters were measured. It lingered in literature, from Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year, written decades later, but with chilling realism to nursery rhymes like Ring a Ring a Roses, which some believe describes the symptoms of the disease. The plague and the fire together forced London to modernize. They destroyed the organic chaos of the medieval city and replaced it with something more orderly, more secure, and perhaps a little less human. The rebuilding led by the brilliant mind of Wren, who designed not only the monument, but also 51 new parish churches and the magnificent new St. Paul's Cathedral, gave London a new architectural identity. It was a city that had looked into the abyss twice in 2 years and had chosen not just to survive, but to rebuild itself stronger. The lessons learned in 1665 and 1666 laid the groundwork for future improvements in public health and urban planning. The idea that the state had a responsibility to regulate construction and sanitation to protect its citizens took hold. The city we know today, with its building regulations, its fire services, and its public health systems, is a direct descendant of the ashes and suffering of that 17th century London. The scar was indelible, but from that wound grew a more resilient metropolis, a city forged in plague and reborn from fire, whose story lies in every brick and every street, waiting to be heard in the quiet of the night. And now, as the story of that distant city fades, you can let your own mind grow still. There is nothing more to tell tonight. There is only rest.